The roar that would not stop. Sensory shock. Kharkiv, early morning, February 24, 2022. The city had lived by an impeccable logic. Its rhythm was the metronome of industry and science. Morning began not with birds, but with a loud, confident hum, the hum of electricity, of hundreds of streetcars and subway trains warming up, of factory workshops. It was the sound of organization, a symphony of planning. The collective consciousness of the city anticipated a workday, lecture halls, endless, predictable movement. It was into this pre-dawn, most vulnerable silence that the first sound arrived. It was not merely an explosion. It was a rupture of matter, an annulment of all the physical laws upon which this multi-storied, complex entity was built. The sound was heavy, metallic, directed. It carried intention, aggression, and a complete lack of remorse. The first seconds were filled with an incredible chaos of sound. A high, piercing screech of flying metal, followed by a low, visceral thud that shook the ground. This thud was non-local. It struck everything that had a foundation and windows, all at once. The old rhythm was annihilated. The familiar hum was replaced by the roar, a constant, escalating, pulsating background noise that came from the north and refused to be silenced. This roar was a hostile voice asserting, "Your world is over. My law is here now, the law of destruction." The sensory shock was complete. The light vanished. The electricity that powered tens of thousands of apartments evaporated the moment of impact. The city, accustomed to security and managed lighting, plunged into a primeval, inhuman darkness. In this darkness, terror became palpable, physical. The most painful sound was the roar of glass. Millions of windows, the lenses of civilization through which the city looked at the world, and itself shattered into tiny, sharp, ringing shards. This tinkling, long and escalating, was the requiem for lost innocence. It filled the streets, entrances, and apartments, mixing with the smell of gunpowder, cold stone, and stirred dust. Every ringing shard of glass was a memory severed. It declared, "You are no longer protected. Your fragility is on full display." The city, a massive, multi-storied organism, recoiled. People fled from high vantage points, moving downward, seeking ground, seeking concrete, seeking salvation in the geometry of fear. The roar did not choose its targets randomly. It struck at symbols. The first targets were symbols of enlightenment and sport: university buildings, sports complexes, museums. It was the intentional murder of the city's collective soul, an attempt to erase history and the future. The ruins of these buildings, frozen in the deafening silence between waves of shelling, were a physical statement. Your mind and your culture are the enemy. But the most terrifying was the murder of comfort. The strike hit residential areas, the high-rise buildings that were bulwarks of private life and family peace. Walls were ripped open, and the intimate space was exposed to public judgment. Shattered dishes on the kitchen table, ripped children's toys, old, tender photographs covered in a thick layer of cement dust. The metaphor of the shard became ubiquitous. Every shard, dirty, sharp, alien, was physical proof of an external invasion into the most personal realm. It lay on pillows, stuck in books, tainted cradles. It asserted, "There is no sanctuary here. Your love and your life are our targets." The roar demanded sacrifices from the infrastructure. Tram wires, the steel threads of movement and connection, were severed, dumped onto the asphalt. Streetcars, frozen on their tracks, were transformed into useless, cold coffins of collective transit. Movement ceased. Logic stopped. Kharkiv emerged from the first shock with a single wound. Its collective mind shifted into survival mode. The only salvation was downward movement. People streamed into underground spaces, the subway, basements, seeking protection in clay and concrete, reverting to the primal logic of the burrow. The roar failed to kill the city's pulsation. It only forced it to shift. The subway, previously a clean, fast artery, transformed into a dirty, but safe, warm womb. Thousands of people lay on the cold granite of the platforms, directly on the rails that morning's trains had sped along. The rails became a symbol of frozen, but not dead, movement. Inside the underground city, a new, collective life was born. The roar remained above. It vibrated in the massive earth and concrete, turning into a low, menacing background hum. But downward, it penetrated as a muffled, distant echo. This echo was a constant reminder of the war, but it allowed life to continue. The light underground was dim, artificial, but it was unwavering. It created shadows but not absolute darkness. The collective consciousness began to reconstruct logic. Neighbors shared water, leftover food. Children drew with chalk on the stained station walls. The first timid attempts at creation in absolute chaos. The roar did not stop. It remained, but the city learned to filter it out. The roar became an external, alien element that no longer commanded the internal rhythm. Kharkiv retreated into itself, but its steel rails of memory and unwavering movement waited for their moment to lead life back to the surface. The geometry of waiting after the sensory shock brought by the roar. The city instinctively sought absolute protection. It found it beneath itself in the steel, concrete womb of the subway. The rails and platforms, designed for speed and logistics, turned into the geometry of waiting, a space where life was confined but preserved. The descent into the underground was an act of humility and necessity. Thousands of people, having shed the excess ballast of peaceful life, carried only the most precious. Children, the elderly, anxious suitcases, and the heavy weight of unspoken fear. The subway's architecture transformed. The platforms, those smooth, cool planes intended for short-term standing, became collective sleeping areas. People lay shoulder to shoulder, head to head, forming living, breathing carpets. In this crowded, warm space, social boundaries dissolved. Professors lay next to laborers, the rich next to the poor. All were united in their vulnerability. The rails, steel and shining, the most sacred element of the subway, lost their purpose. Trains no longer rushed over them. The rails became a refuge for the most desperate and needy. For those who found no room on the platforms, they lay between the tracks, feeling the cold, hard metal beneath them. It was an affirmation of a last hope for order. The geometry of waiting was paradoxical. On one hand, it provided an incredible sense of safety. The concrete arches absorbed the roar from the surface, turning the threat into a distant, muffled echo. This echo was a constant reminder, but it allowed people to sleep, breathe, and live. On the other hand, it was a space devoid of a horizon. There were no windows, no stars, no change of day and night. Time became warped, sluggish, and viscous. The only anchor was the artificial, dim lighting that burned continuously, erasing the boundaries of the day. The daily life of the underground city was reconstructed by the collective mind. Water was obtained by the courage of the few who ascended to the surface, risking their lives for the common need. Every bottle of water was an artifact, a symbol of care and risk. Light was created by the community. Flashlights, candles, the headlights of trains abandoned in the stations all combined to maintain visibility. Light was a psychological tool resisting the absolute darkness of war. Sound. A new sound of the city was born here, quiet, multi-layered. The rustle of blankets, the soft, interrupted breathing of the sleepers, a child's cry. Whispered prayers. It was a collective, primal sound of survival that was the opposite of the loud, metallic roar from the surface. The underground city became a school of a new ethic, the ethic of survival. Conflicts yielded to silent agreement. Selfishness lost its meaning, as everyone's life depended on the tranquility of their neighbor. Children, the city's most honest indicators of state, adapted the fastest. They turned the dirty station walls into canvases, drawing suns, houses, and streetcars with chalk. These drawings were a silent protest against the horror, an affirmation of the right to a future and to color. The collective consciousness held onto hope. Hope for movement. They looked at the rails, those steel lines that ran into the dark tunnels. The rails were a promise. They were still there. They were waiting. When the threat from above vanished, the rails would once again fulfill their function: forward motion, a return to the light, a return to speed. The geometry of waiting was a temporary refuge. It was a pause in life, but not its end. Kharkiv lay low and deep, conserving its strength, its people, and its rails, to complete the most important journey, the journey of restoration. The red line after the long, viscous confinement in the geometry of waiting underground. The moment of egress arrived. It was not a joyful liberation, but a forced, painful act. The need for water, medicine, or simply breathing different air overcame the primal fear of the surface. The ascent on the escalator that was not moving was symbolic. It was a climb from the world of silence into the world of the roar. The light that appeared at the end of the tunnel was not soft sunlight, but a harsh, dirty, anxious glare. The city that met the collective consciousness was transformed. It was wounded, but not broken. It was a frozen, stunning monument to its own horror. Kharkiv's center, its historical heart. Its red line carried the deepest scars. Previously, this red line was the city's nerve. Clean, wide streets, majestic buildings of universities, squares, and theaters. It pulsed with movement, speed, and intellect. Now, it was silent, its pulse suppressed. The first thing that struck was the air. It was heavy, acrid, a mixture of the smell of gunpowder, cold concrete, damp dust, and something else, the smell of loss. This scent was physical confirmation that the roar was working ceaselessly. Buildings stood decapitated. Their facades, which boasted of their history and architectural style, were riddled with shrapnel, pierced by shells. Baroque swirls, neoclassical columns, all were annihilated with an indifferent, barbaric force. Windows, shattered by the blast wave, yawned with black, empty eye sockets. They stared at the sky, reflecting clouds, but seeing no light. They were the eyes of the city, blinded by horror. We saw the ruins of the university, a temple of knowledge. Its walls were breached, its library destroyed. Books, carriers of collective wisdom, lay in the street, soaked in water and covered in mud. This was a deliberate assassination of memory and intellect. The central square, where crowds of students and citizens once gathered, was mutilated by massive, circular craters. These craters, ripped from the asphalt and earth, were absolute, undisguised evidence of brutality. They were winter inside spring. The tram tracks lying along the red line were mangled, the rails twisted, the wires torn, the steel supports listing. The tram, which was once a symbol of movement and accessibility, was now a symbol of frozen, paralyzed life. The collective consciousness felt a sharp, cutting pain of loss. It was grief for beauty that was murdered. Every crack, every chip on a facade was a personal wound. But the most important thing, the city was not dead. Signs of incredible resilience broke through the ruins. Doctors, exhausted and dirty, continued to work in semi-destroyed hospitals. Firefighters fought fires, ignoring the ongoing roar. Utility workers stubbornly mended torn wires under the whistle of shells. People, like shadows, moved over the shards, searching for water and food. Their movement was quiet, calculated. They looked down, avoiding eye contact, but their collective will was tangible. They refused to leave. They refused to concede the defeat of their home. The red line was red not only from blood and dust, but from unwavering, hot resistance. Kharkiv stood. It breathed heavily, groaned under the blows. But its heart, its people continued to beat underground and on the surface. The route that contracted, the tram route to Saltivka, was more than just a transit line for Kharkiv. It was an artery connecting the intellectual center with a huge, densely populated residential area. It was a line of social equality, a connection between work and home. It had an impeccable, logical geometry designed for efficient, fast movement. Now, this geometry was ripped apart. The tram tracks that traced this route became a physical reflection of the collective trauma. They were a wounded, crippled thread that began relatively whole in the center near the red line. But the further east it went, the more it plunged into chaos and destruction. The roar from the north targeted this route with particular cruelty. It struck the tram depots, bombed the turning circles, and ripped out the contact wires, the nerves of electric movement. The route contracted. Its length was measured not in kilometers, but in risk. Trams that still dared to leave the depot crawled only along short, relatively safe sections, stopping where the iron road turned into a heap of twisted metal and buried craters. The contraction of the route was a metaphor for the narrowing of peaceful life. Opportunities for movement, access to water and food, everything was shrinking to a radius that could be reached on foot or by a bus dodging the roar. The collective consciousness remembered every meter of the lost path. The section near the market there, the rails were buried under the debris of pavilions. The aesthetic of commerce died under the shrapnel. The section near the school there, the catenary supports were listing, resembling falling. Mutilated crosses. Wires lay on the ground, carrying 0 volts, a symbol of disconnected, lifeless communication. The most painful section was on the border of Saltivka. Here, the rails were physically torn from the asphalt by a direct hit. They jutted upward, twisted into spirals, a symbol of the unbearable scream of metal. The tram could no longer go there. It stopped at the last possible point, dropping off passengers in the face of the greatest danger. The waiting for movement became a common, unspoken prayer. Kharkiv looked at the shortened route and understood. The world will return when the rails are whole. The restoration of every meter of the lost line was not just a repair task, but a physical act of rebirth, an affirmation of the right to the city's integrity. The collective mind recorded the damage and planned the future. Utility services, those quiet, fearless heroes, worked under the roar, clearing debris from the rails, straightening supports. Their labor was an incredible, absurd defiance of chaos. They prepared the path for the last tram, stubbornly believing in its return. A tram carriage, frozen on a short, safe section, was a new, fragile sanctuary. People sat in it silently, looking at the ruined path ahead. Saltivka was visible, but inaccessible. Destroyed, but their own. The route contracted, but the city's will was not broken. The rails, mutilated but present, were a promise of restoration that would be complete. The last pavilion, the stubbornness of the everyday after the roar and the shock of the destruction. Along the red line, the city faced a primal necessity. Survival. Survival demanded water, heat, energy, and the most important thing, a psychological anchor. And this anchor was found in the most fragile and unexpected place. The last pavilion. The pavilion was a point of tension and contrast. Its location was symbolic, on the border of the still whole and the already destroyed, not far from the frozen, mangled tram rails. It was the last bastion of commerce and routine. This pavilion was a small, metal square that, in peacetime, sold cigarettes, coffee, and small, unnecessary joys. Now, it was transformed into a strategic object of survival. Its physics were painful. Its walls were dented by the blast wave, like a tin can. The rolling shutters jammed, and they opened with a painful, screeching groan that seemed misplaced in the atmosphere of suppressed fear. The service window, a small square of glass replaced by a piece of plywood or thick polyethylene, resembled a squinting, stubborn eye. Inside the pavilion, an order reigned, absurd amid the external chaos. Goods were neatly arranged on the surviving shelves. There was no abundance of past years, but there were the essentials. Candles, the new equivalent of sunlight, batteries, the new unit of time and communication, mineral water, cookies, and cigarettes. Cigarettes became a special artifact. They were currency, comfort, a means of controlling breath. The slow inhalation of smoke was an act of slowing down the madness. The pavilion operated on the logic of contrast. Every morning, when the roar softened to a quiet, distant rumble, the consciousness of the pavilion made a decision to open. It was a decision based on risk, on faith in the randomness of calm. The seller, a shadow united with the collective mind, stood behind the counter, wrapped in old clothes. His face was gray, his eyes constantly scanning the sky and the surrounding ruins. Dialogue had died. Transactions happened silently. The customer, another shadow of the city, approached the pavilion with quick, uncertain steps. They did not linger. They knew that every second in the open air was a lottery. The exchange was a ritual. 1. A quiet, short request, usually candle or water. 2. A quick extraction of banknotes, wrinkled and soaked with the smell of the basement. 3. The instantaneous handover of the goods, wrapped in old newspaper. The pavilion owner did not take change. Change was a symbol of precision and excess, and in the geometry of waiting, there was only necessity. The pavilion refused to die. Its resilience was not commercial, but psychological. It provided the remnants of the collective mind with proof that order still existed, that money had value, that goods existed, that tomorrow could be bought with a biscuit and a battery. The pavilion's main task was not to sell, but to create a time frame. Its opening signaled the start of the conventional day, its closing signaled the arrival of a new, thicker darkness. When the roar escalated, becoming sharp and close, the pavilion's rolling shutters closed instantly, with a loud, metallic clang. This was the audible signal to the collective consciousness: hide. The threat is near. In that moment, the only light went out, and the pavilion turned into another gray, dented shard of the city landscape. The last pavilion was a bridge. It connected life before and life now. It stood stubbornly near the rails that did not move, but that were waiting. Every act of buying a candle or a bottle of water was a vote for continuation. A vote for Kharkiv. A vote against absolute chaos. Neighbors without faces war, having destroyed the forms of property and status, reforged human connections. In the multi-story, wounded buildings standing on the border between the roar and the silence, a new community was born. The neighbors without faces. These were the remainers. Those who could not, would not, or refused to flee. Their life was reduced to the simple, primal logic of survival within the confines of a single entranceway or a single basement. Faces lost their individuality. They were gray, haggard, covered with a layer of cement dust and sleep deprivation. Gazes were focused inward or downward, searching for water or shelter. Names were forgotten, replaced by function. The one who carries the water, the one who has the medicine, the old man who knows where it is safer. Communication died. Words became irrelevant and dangerous. A loud voice could attract the roar. Conversations were replaced by quiet, silent rituals. 1. Gesture. A slow, slight nod, a greeting and a question about safety. 2. Movement. A silent, calculated descent down the dark stairwell, a synchronized act of moving toward the communal Basement during an alert. 3. Gaze. A long, penetrating look that communicated everything. I'm alive. You're alive. Hold on. The apartment building transformed into an organism. Each floor, each apartment, was a wound, but the basement was the heart that beat with a collective, strained rhythm. Tragedy gave birth to the highest form of responsibility. Anonymity gave birth to the purest altruism. Food was shared silently. Leftover crackers. The last can of preserves appeared on a communal table without the donor being named. To take too much was a moral crime that required no punishment. Conscience was a sufficient judge. Warmth. Blankets and old dirty throws served as collective heating. The weakest unit, the elderly or a child, was placed in the center of the living, breathing carpet of bodies. The stranger's blanket became public property. Safety. Neighbors organized silent watches at the basement entrance. Their function was simple: to warn of the start of a new roar and to ensure that all the vulnerable reached the shelter. The collective mind recorded a neighbor's damage as its own. If the shelling damaged the water pipe on the 5th floor, the entire community participated in the repair, not because of friendship, but because of the logic of survival. Everyone needs water. Silence protected them from madness. Words about war repeated the horror. Silence concentrated energy on action. Up there, the roar destroyed the steel tram rails and concrete. Here, inside, the silence built new, invisible walls of community. The city stood not because of the army, though its presence was vital, but because of the resilience of the neighbors without faces, a quiet, anonymous, unvanquished mass that refused to turn into victims and chose to be the roots. The scars of Saltivka, the culmination of pain, the time the city endured in the geometry of waiting, compressed into one shared, monotonous suffering. But the collective mind knew, not all pain is the same. There existed a place where the roar worked with particular, methodical cruelty. And that place was Saltivka. Saltivka was a city within a city, a vast, densely populated labyrinth of panel high-rises. It was the quintessential Soviet planning, where millions of lives flowed parallel, quietly, routinely. It was against this routine, this ordinariness, that the machine of destruction was unleashed. The path into Saltivka was a path into the epicenter. The tram rails had long frozen at the last, safe point of their shrunk route. Beyond lay territory governed by chance and death. The air here was different. It was thick, dense, permeated with the smell of burning, smoldering plastic, metallic grit, and cold, heavy dust. Breathing became labored, feeling like the filtration of physical pain. The landscape changed dramatically. There were no isolated ruins here, as on the Red Line. Here was mass, serial annihilation. The high-rises stood, but they were turned into nightmarish, monotonous skeletons. Windows, thousands of windows, were blown out. They gaped as endless, empty eye sockets, staring into non-existence. Facades were riddled with shrapnel, like thousands of black pockmarks. These buildings were wounded not once, but dozens of times, methodically, deliberately. The horror of Saltivka was its exposure. Walls were breached clean through from facade to back. The city's consciousness saw continuous, cold light penetrating through apartments, through life. Kitchens lay in the street, bedrooms were suspended over the abyss. Wallpaper fluttered in the wind like torn skin. This was a public, total humiliation of privacy. Every apartment was exposed and left on display. A baby's crib covered in broken glass, a stack of books mangled by fire, a sofa ripped open by shrapnel. These remnants of routine were artifacts of interrupted life. They were an accusation against those who destroyed not military bases, but cradles and comfort. The courtyards of Saltivka turned into a battlefield and chaos. Playgrounds were warped, swings twisted, sandboxes buried under slab debris. Shell craters, huge round wounds, lay next to flower beds that stubbornly tried to bloom. The roar here was different. It was closer, physically palpable. It vibrated in the chest, a reminder of the constant, unbearable proximity of death. The most terrifying thing was the absence of sound. The roar could leave, but the silence remained. The silence of abandoned apartments, of lives left behind. Only the creak of a ripped-off door and the wind broke this piece of the ruins. The collective consciousness felt that Saltivka was the deepest wound of the fortress city. It was the symbol of the pain that Kharkiv carried for the whole country. It was the proof of genocide against ordinariness and the right to peaceful sleep. But even here, life did not surrender. Inside these mutilated homes, in the basements, in the damp, cold burrows, remained the neighbors without faces. They carried water, shared food, helped the elderly. Their stubbornness affirmed, Saltivka will live, even in this hell. The roar could not kill the will of the city. It only replaced the architecture of comfort with the architecture of resilience. The sound of mopeds, a new anxiety after the initial shock and mutual hardening in Saltivka. The roar of the metallic, large-caliber weapons began to recede. It did not vanish, it merely shifted in space, turning into a low, anxious rumble on the periphery of the collective hearing. The city grew accustomed to this background, heavy, yet predictable in its massiveness. But war abhors monotony. It seeks new, subtler ways to penetrate the psyche, and it found it in a new sound: thin, high-pitched, annoying, the sound of mopeds. The sound of mopeds was a psychological weapon, the absolute opposite of the original roar. The roar was straightforward, masculine, deafening. It demanded immediate action. Drop, hide, run. The sound of mopeds was feminine, slow, mocking. It gave time for fear but not for salvation. It arrived at night, when the collective consciousness was trying to recover its strength in the semi-darkness of basements and the metro. It began as a distant, low buzzing, resembling a massive, angry insect lost in the sky. Gradually, the buzzing intensified, becoming clearer, transforming into the distinctive, recognizable crackle of a cheap engine. The city, a massive, living organism, trained its hearing. In peacetime, high frequencies were filtered out as insignificant. The noise of a mosquito, a distant scooter. Now, the collective hearing sharpened to the limit, learning to isolate this deadly tone from the countless chaos of ruined life. Identification. It's not a car, the sound is too stable. It's not a helicopter, the vibration is too low. It's not a plane, the speed is too slow. It is him, the drone, the deadly moped. Localization. The direction of the sound was determined instinctively, with almost animal intuition. Hearing strained from basements and apartments, trying to figure out, is it for me? Is it passing by? Or is it heading for the neighbors? Inevitability. When the sound reached its climax, loud, clear, vibrating right overhead, time stopped. A second full of absolute silence ensued, marking the engine's shutdown before the final, deadly dive. And then the impact. Inevitable, precise, destructive. The psychological terror was immense. Artillery roar forced immediate, quick hiding. The sound of mopeds forced one to listen to one's own death, slowly approaching from the heavens. The sky, which in peacetime was a symbol of freedom and horizon, turned into a zone of constant, invisible threat. The city developed a new habit, looking up, not for stars, but for the search for a dark, silent point carrying death. The drone was the perfect weapon for terror. It was cheap, accessible, and its buzzing turned the night sky into a personal, anxious room. The collective consciousness shifted to listening mode. Bedroom. Sleep became shallow, interrupted. Every noise was suddenly analyzed. A creaking board, the wind, a pop in the neighbor's yard, randomness, but the high, thin whine threat. The pillow was not for rest, but for muffling fear. Street. Movement on the streets of Kharkiv changed. People hurried, froze under awnings, used house walls as shields. The sound of mopeds commanded, do not stand, do not talk, do not be a target. Technology. The city learned to use its resources against this threat. The quiet rumble of generators in basements suddenly stopped, not for saving, but for listening to the sky. The sound of mopeds dictated new rules of collective hygiene. Silence became an absolute necessity. Loud conversations, laughter, which was so rare, even a loud cough, became taboo. The city fell silent, listening to the threat and trying to become invisible to it. Artillery roar destroyed massively, obliterating districts. The sound of mopeds inflicted precise, surgical strikes on the life support system of the fortress city. Energy. Drones targeted transformer substations, power lines, heating points. They tried to freeze the city, blind it, deprive it of connection. Each strike was accompanied by a flash of light and a long, agonizing wail of sirens. Tram tracks. The shrunk route became a special target. Drones hit tram depots, destroying the few surviving carriages, burning the electric network. This was an attack on the very idea of movement and restoration. Every destroyed tram was a psychological signal. You will go no further. Your future is stopped. Water? Water intakes. Pumping station strikes on these points carried a collective, slow horror. Cold, thirst, disease. The psychological insidiousness of the sound of mopeds lay in its impersonality. These were not soldiers. They were not pilots. This was a mechanical, indifferent death, controlled from afar. This destroyed any notion of fair combat or even personal hatred. The sound of mopeds sought to replace the roar with a subtler, corroding suffering. But the city answered with the stubbornness of the rhythm. The collective consciousness learned to ignore the alarm, to move to action despite the buzzing. Music. In basements, in the surviving pavilions, music played softly. Ukrainian music, songs. The sound of the human voice became an act of resistance against the mechanical crackle of the drone. Melody defeated the monotony of death. Light. When a drone destroyed a transformer. The next day the neighbors, without faces, obtained a new generator. The light, gained through hard labor and risk, burned brighter than before. Light was an affirmation. We will see. We will not be in the dark. Repair. Utility workers worked faster than the drones destroyed. Welded pipes, raised wires, straightened rails. Every act of repair was a response to the sound of mopeds. You strike us, but we fix ourselves faster than you can aim. Kharkiv emerged from this period adapted. The sound of mopeds could not break the will to live. It entered the collective hearing as yet another element of the background, but not as the master. The city remembered the roar and the sound of mopeds, and it prepared for the day when the only loud sound in the sky would be the noise of construction cranes, and on the ground the confident, continuous rumble of the last tram. The light bulb in the basement light in the darkness after the sensory terror of the roar, and the sound of mopeds, the third, most insidious enemy arrived. Darkness. The machine of destruction shifted to the systematic annihilation of the fortress city's energy arteries. The blackout was not just an absence of light. It was a psychological invasion, an attempt to return Kharkiv to a primal state, devoid of logic and temporal dimension. When the electricity vanished suddenly, sharply, as a result of a precise surgical strike, darkness seized the space instantly. This was not nighttime darkness, softened by the moon or distant lights. This was absolute, dense, tangible darkness that smelled of cold, dampness, and metal. Darkness annulled the horizon. Inside the high-rise buildings and basements, distances ceased to exist. People became blind, forced to rely on the most primitive senses, touch and hearing. Cold as a weapon. Darkness brought the cold, without heat pumps, without electric heating. The concrete walls absorbed the frost and radiated it inward. The cold shackled bodies, slowed thoughts, threatening a slow, agonizing death by hypothermia. The resilience of the neighbors without faces was now measured by the thickness of the blanket, and the power of collective, huddled warmth, amplification of the roar. In the visual void, sound became the dominant sense. The roar from the north and the sound of mopeds intensified, becoming especially ominous. Lacking the ability to see the threat, the collective hearing worked at its limit, tensely trying to localize the site of impact or the trajectory of the buzzing. Darkness was an ally of terror, erasure of time. Clocks stopped. The day lost meaning. Darkness turned day and night into a single, monotonous wait. The only measure of time became the number of candles burned, and successful ascents to the surface for water. Darkness tried to kill the very idea of civilization in Kharkiv, the idea of managed light and heat. The collective consciousness responded to the invasion of darkness with an act of incredible stubbornness. The fight for light became a sacred mission. The generator became the artifact of this struggle. The generator, noisy, dirty, consuming scarce fuel, turned into a collective altar. Its acquisition, delivery often by hand, through the ruins and under the roar, and setup required heroic effort. The generator startup ceremony was a ritual unifying the neighbors without faces. Silence of expectation. Everyone froze, listening to the steps of the mechanic, often the most stubborn resident of the stairwell. 2. The pull. A sharp tug of the starting cord. The first cough of the motor. 3. The victory. The smooth, loud, vibrating hum of the generator. This hum was cleaner and more native than any roar of war. It was the sound of work, the sound of control. And then she lit up. The light bulb in the basement. A small, dim, often bare incandescent bulb, hanging on a single, miraculously surviving wire. Its light was warm, yellow, uncertain, but it was there. This light could not illuminate everything. It created only a tiny island of visibility in a sea of absolute darkness. But its psychological impact was immense. It marked the center. It said, here, in this spot, the law of Kharkiv is in effect. The law of life. The light of the bulb resolved the main issue. Seeing faces, light restored names. It illuminated the eyes of children who could draw again, and the hands of doctors who could work. Light became a precious commodity managed with utmost moral responsibility. The collective consciousness developed a strict, unwritten etiquette of light. Operating hours. The generator ran for no more than 2 or 3 hours a day, hours dedicated to the most essential needs, charging batteries for communication, boiling water for hygiene, and administering first aid. Every minute of light was accounted for. Usage. Light was used strictly for function. It could not be wasted on entertainment or idleness. It illuminated the medication schedule, the basement layout, the face of the person speaking on the phone, moral duty. The person responsible for the generator and the light bulb carried an extremely heavy moral burden. They had to decide to whom to give the last liters of fuel. Priority was always given to the sick, the elderly, and the very tram crew preparing for tomorrow's repairs. The light of the bulb contrasted with the horror of Saltivka. Up above, homes gaped with black shell holes. Below, in the basement, a small light burned. This fragmentation of reality demonstrated the city's resilience. Light a firm presence where darkness desired absence. The light bulb in the basement was more than a light source. It was a combat artifact. Its trembling light created a psychological defense against invisible terror. Darkness forced a person to retreat inward, amplifying fear and loneliness. Light drew the collective consciousness outward, uniting it around a common, visible point. The roar of war was the sonic frequency of destruction. The light bulb was the optical frequency of hope. The generator emitted its own stubborn hum, which negated the sound of mopeds. This was the noise of creation against the noise of annihilation. The light fell on the hands of utility workers who repaired equipment. Preparing for the ascent to the surface, they worked by the light of the bulb, planning the restoration of the rails that would carry the tram back to the light. The light of the bulb was a promise. It said, "We'll not forget what light looks like. We'll not forget how to build. We will return the light to the entire red line and bring it all the way to Saltivka." Kharkiv remembered what absolute, bright, continuous freedom of electricity was. And for the sake of that memory, it protected its small, fragile, yet unwavering light bulb in the basement. The aroma of life, the stubborn scent, the sensory experience of the fortress city was cruel. In the early stages of the war, sight was blinded by explosions and hearing deafened by the roar. But the most long-lasting, most insidious carrier of pain turned out to be smell. The air of Kharkiv was polluted not only by dust and ash. It was permeated by a layered, toxic composition of war that the collective consciousness learned to identify. With the precision of a chemist, one the baseline smell of destruction, the acrid, alkaline aroma of cement dust mixed with the cold, putrid dampness of abandoned basements. This was the smell of dead architecture, the smell of slow, structural death. The active enemy smell of gunpowder, a sharp, metallic smell of burned gunpowder and red-hot iron from shrapnel. This smell signaled immediate threat. It irritated the nasal cavity and instantly activated the flight mode in the neighbors without faces. 3. The psychological marker smell of diesel, the heavy, oily smell of diesel fuel from generators and military equipment. This was a dual scent. It brought hope, light, warmth, connection, and anxiety. The presence of military activity and risk. The most terrifying aroma, the cold, specific smell of oblivion and irrecoverable loss that lingered in the destroyed, exposed apartments. This smell was the unbearable carrier of human tragedy. This olfactory terror was constant. It penetrated the basements, ingrained itself in clothing, and became the very air the city breathed. It attempted to kill the memories of cleanliness and comfort. It was in this viscous, toxic background that a miracle occurred, the breakthrough of the aroma of life. It arrived unexpectedly and abruptly, like an invasion, but an invasion of good. It was the pure, warm, Swedish smell of hot bread and fermenting yeast. The smell of sugar, caramelization, and flour undergoing a successful, peaceful transformation. This smell was wrong. It should not have existed here. It was a bold, impudent contrast to the smell of gunpowder. It was the noise of peace breaking through the military roar. The collective consciousness reacted instantly and profoundly. The aroma provoked not just hunger, but a sharp, painful nostalgia for routine. Residents emerging from the basements inhaled it in deep, interrupted breaths. It was information, vital, crucial information. Somewhere there is warmth. Somewhere there is work. Somewhere there is a person who believes in tomorrow. The aroma carried a charge not just of calories, but of psychological power. It reminded them of the primal, clean code of existence. Warmth, food, safety. It served as a sensory bridge between destroyed Saltivka and the Red Line. That still remembered peace. The source of the aroma became a new, unspoken fortress of the city. It was a small bakery or a miraculously surviving basement shop, where a person remained the keeper of the craft. This person worked underground, by the light of a generator bulb, in absolute darkness and danger. His labor was sacred. He kneaded the dough in a rhythm that negated the chaos of the roar. His hands, covered in flour, the purest, white material in the city, created form from the formless. The act of raising the dough, baking it in the oven, required fuel, water, and incredible courage. Fire as defiance. The oven, heated to the limit, was a challenge to the cold and darkness. Its heat spread through the basement, warming not only the dough but the neighbors who slept nearby. Smoke from the oven was a risk. It could attract the sound of mopeds, but the human need for bread was stronger than this threat. Rhythm of life. The sound of the knife hitting the wooden table. The hiss of water thrown onto the hot stones of the oven. This was the new, clean sonic backdrop. This rhythm was the truth that countered the lie of war. The keeper of the craft did not work for profit. Money had lost its meaning. He worked to maintain the chain of civilization, so that the city would not forget what peace smelled like. The aroma of life traveled through the destroyed streets of Kharkiv. It crossed the cracks in the asphalt, penetrated through the blown-out windows, and rose from the basements. It was the invisible channel of communication between the survivors. The smell of bread told the neighbors without faces, "Hold fast. We will manage. There will be breakfast." It canceled the feeling of loneliness, uniting all who could catch it into a single, collective expectation. It reminded them that the tram rails, lying dead on the ground, would soon move again. Because there was fuel for this movement, faith in ordinariness. The aroma was the most reliable guarantee of the future. It promised that when the last roar subsided, the city would again be filled with the clean, warm smells of peace, and the smell of gunpowder would disappear from memory forever. The city calendar measuring time war destroyed time. It erased the boundaries between day and night in the geometry of waiting underground, and shattered the continuity of weeks and months on the surface. For the collective consciousness of Kharkiv, the official calendar lost its meaning. The date on the wall was an abstraction, unrelated to reality. The city developed its own internal system of chronology, the city calendar. It was unwritten, unofficial, but absolutely precise and vital. Its units of measurement were events, threats, and acts of resilience. The most basic and irrefutable unit of time measurement was the air raid alert. The day was divided not into hours, but into intervals between two warnings. The alert was the pulse of danger, a metronome that reminded them of the enemy's constant presence in the sky. Waiting. Periods of calm were not peace. They were waiting. This was a time filled with tension, when the collective hearing worked with double force, searching for the roar or the sound of mopeds. The length of the waiting determined the level of collective anxiety. Event. The alert itself was an event. It demanded the immediate cessation of all peaceful activities and retreat underground. The number of events per day indicated the intensity of the front and the level of threat. 7 alerts in a day meant a heavy day. 11 catastrophe. The underground calendar. Neighbors without faces, sitting in the metro, kept count by the days spent underground. 20 days in a train car were an entire epoch, measured by the smell of dampness and the light of the dim light bulb. The second, more optimistic element of the city calendar was based on work. The unit of measuring progress and resilience was repair. Time was measured by the return of functions destroyed by the war. Water. Days were measured by the return of pressure in the pipes. Yesterday was water pipe day, meant that the heroic utility workers labored under fire and restored a vital artery. The return of a drop of clean water to the tap was a celebration, marked by the whole community. Light. A month without light ended with generator day. The return of electricity for a short time became a milestone, crossing the line of chaos. The light from the light bulb in the basement was a marker of the success of collective labor. Heat. Winter weeks were measured by the return of heat to the radiators. Heat day was the day when the frost was defeated by the resilience of the workers and the faith of the city. Every repair was a small victory over the enemy, recorded in the collective memory as a historical date. The most important, most emotionally significant unit of measuring the future was the run Ries, the run of the tram. The route that shrank was the symbol of the city's paralyzed body. The return of the tram to the line was the return of the very idea of movement and progress. The first run. The first successful run on a newly restored section of rails was a celebration. The tram, squeaking, rumbling, moving beneath the roar, became a hero. Its steel rhythm was the soundtrack to hope. Route expansion. Time was measured by the increase in the length of the route. Every new stop included in the schedule was a conquered territory, reclaimed from chaos. The tram reached NTH Street was a victory report, more important than any military dispatch. The stubborn conductor. The run was an affirmation of the staff's stubbornness. Every driver who brought a train car out of the depot under the sounds of drones became a living marker in the calendar, a symbol of human will. The city calendar was a complex algorithm combining fear alert, work repair, and hope run. Saltivka waited for its run. Its scars remained deep, but the collective consciousness knew. Time moves, albeit slowly. It is measured not by numbers, but by the resilience of iron and concrete. And as long as the rails lie and await repair, the future is not cancelled. The indestructible memorial, the heroism of work. Heroism in Kharkiv was measured not only by meters of reclaimed land. It was measured by cubic meters of water, kilowatts of returned light, and the integrity of pipes lying underground. The most unyielding symbol of the city's resilience was the working class, the utility services. Their labor was an invisible, yet indestructible, memorial. The machine of destruction worked around the clock, annihilating the life support systems. The roar and the sound of mopeds targeted not facades, but the city's nerves, heat lines, gas lines, cables. The utility workers answered every strike with an act of creation. The most sacred mission was the fight for water and heat, in the geometry of waiting and Saltivka, where cold and thirst were mortal enemies. Restoring communications was equivalent to saving lives. Warriors of the water pipes. They worked underground, in cold, flooded trenches, surrounded by broken concrete. Pipes torn by shrapnel were their enemies. Their labor was physically harsh, welding in the rain, pumping out dirty water, crawling in narrow passages. They carried the smell of dampness and fuel oil. But the result of their labor was pure, a drop of water returned to the tap. Every restored pipe was a new, invisible thread of life. Heat repairers. Winter became the enemy's ally. Ruptures in the heat lines threatened to freeze entire districts. These people went to the surface under shelling to weld the city's huge, steaming wounds. They worked quickly, precisely, knowing that their delay meant cold for the neighbors without faces. Heat returned to the radiator was the most powerful response to cold terror. The electricians were the warriors of light. Their enemy was darkness, the total, frightening absence of logic. Linemen under the roar. They climbed up, onto listing supports, onto the roofs of destroyed buildings, to connect severed cables. Working at height under the sound of drones required absolute courage. Their work was immediately visible, a flash of light, the light bulb in the basement turning on. The return of a pulse to the street. The fight for communication. They repaired not only power cables, but fiber optics, the nerves of communication. Restoring internet and mobile connection was an act of returning the city to the world. The possibility of hearing the voice of loved ones was a gift brought by these people. The symbolism of light. Every restored street lamp was a new, small memorial. It said, "Here, we control the space. Darkness retreats." The most symbolic labor belonged to the workers servicing the tram network. They were preparing the path for the future, reclaiming every meter of the route that shrank, clearing the ruins. They dismantled the rubble on the rails, tons of concrete, twisted metal, broken glass. Their shovels and jackhammers were tools not of destruction, but of purification. Straightening the line. They welded severed rails, raised supports, and tightened contact wires. Their labor was an act of reviving the geometry of movement. They refused to admit that the tram should stop forever. The indestructible memorial. Their labor was the memorial of resilience. These were not statues of stone or bronze. These were living people who, daily, with their sweat and risk, asserted Kharkiv's right to the future. Their feat was recorded not on plaques, but in the steel of the rails, the copper of the wires, the purity of the water. It was a memorial that pulsed with life. The collective consciousness saw their work. It respected their silence, their exhaustion. They were the foundation of the fortress city. Their labor was the code that allowed Kharkiv to await the day when the last tram would rumble once again on the restored rails. The stubborn conductor movement, despite the city held out, the threat of the roar did not vanish, but the collective consciousness integrated it into the background noise. Light bulbs burned in the basements, the aroma of life spread, and the indestructible memorial of utility labor asserted order. But the main challenge remained movement. The tram, the symbol of Kharkiv's speed, logic, and unity, continued its mission on the shrunk route. It was a lame, stubborn heart that refused to stop. Inside the tram, on the last functioning line, were they, the stubborn conductor and the silent driver. Their work was not merely running a route, it was a daily, ritual act of defending normality. The tram was the only loud, metallic rhythm that reminded them of the former life. It squeaked on the twisted rails, its wheels clanged at the joints, and the rumble of the motor fought the distant roar. The silent driver led the car. His face, covered with fatigue and ingrained dust, was turned forward, toward that invisible, dangerous point where the rails were torn. His hands were precise, his movements measured, because every run was a duel with debris, potholes, and temporary patches on the tracks. The tram moved slowly, but continuously. Its speed was consciously lowered not out of fear, but out of respect for the destruction. It was a metaphor for Kharkiv's own speed. We move, but we remember every blow. For the neighbors without faces remaining in the city, the passing tram was a living calendar. Its appearance meant, the system is functioning. The connection is not broken. It asserted logic against chaos. The stubborn conductor was the heart of this mission. Her function was absurd in a time of war, selling tickets and controlling payment. She stood in the car, dressed in a clean vest and uniform that seemed an inappropriate ritual of beauty. Against the gray dust, her gestures were unhurried, her voice quiet, so as not to attract the roar was steady. The ticket became an artifact. It was not a fare for the ride, but a payment for faith in the future. By buying a ticket, the passenger voted for the restoration of the route, for the preservation of the tram depot, for the right to movement according to a schedule. The conductor completed this exchange in silence. She accepted the crumpled banknotes smelling of the basement and issued a smooth, clean piece of paper proof that the economy still existed, that values were not nullified. Her stubbornness was unyielding. She did not allow fare dodgers. This was not out of cruelty, but out of discipline. Breaking the rules meant introducing chaos into the last bastion of order. The tram had to remain an island of law amidst the ruins. The driver and the conductor were a duo of resilience. Their unity told the city, "We are here, we are on post, and we will not retreat." The tram passengers were an army of hope of a sort. They sat silently, not looking at each other, but feeling a collective connection. They looked out the windows at the twisted buildings, at the debris, at the indestructible memorial of the utility workers' labor along the tracks. The rails were a mirror of their destinies. Where a rail was welded, there was hope. Where it was twisted into a spiral, there was the pain of Saltivka. The tram was a psychological capsule. Inside, there was warmth and light from the light bulb outside. There was the roar and darkness. Passengers experienced temporary relief because they were moved by a force they did not control, but which they trusted. The conductor looked at them and saw her own reflection. All of them were stubborn. They were riding for bread, for medicine, for the stubborn right to movement. The tram reached its last, shrunk point. The conductor announced the stop in a quiet voice. Passengers exited and moved onward on foot into the risk zone. But they exited with a ticket in their pocket and the rhythm of the rails in their soul. Proof that the movement would continue. The new passenger, the eyes that saw after the first, shocking waves of flight and the long, exhausting phase of persistent waiting in the basements. The collective consciousness of Kharkiv began to register a new phenomenon. The return. These people, returning from the distant frontiers of evacuation, were the new passengers. They arrived on buses, on trains, in private, dusty cars, crossing the invisible border between the quiet, distant world and the world of the roar. Their return was an act of incredible courage and a deep, unassuageable yearning for home. But the city met them not with joy, but with truth. For the new passengers, Kharkiv existed into parallel realities. The first, the ideal, clean, loud city imprinted in memory. The second, what they saw now. The shock of recognition was physical. They searched for familiar landmarks. The whole, tall university building, the noisy market, the straight, steel tram rails. And in their place, they found ruins, twisted metal, huge craters. The olfactory blow. The very first enemy was the air. They inhaled the toxic mixture of char, dust, and the cold dampness of destroyed buildings. This smell was proof that their memory was lying. It was the absolute opposite of the aroma of life, which was nonetheless trying to break through the chaos. Visual suppression. The shattered windows of Saltivka, the black shell holes on the red-lined facades, suppressed the will. The city looked old, sick, commanded to be silent. To see a familiar house without a roof, without windows, that was equivalent to losing a loved one. The eyes of the new passengers were the most precise indicator of pain. They were wide, wary, constantly scanning the sky for a new threat. They did not know how to use the collective sound filter, and every sharp noise made them flinch. Kharkiv acted as a strict teacher for them. It did not promise them comfort, but it offered truth. The city silently told the returnees, "I endured, but I am wounded. You must accept my pain before you can start to build anew." The lesson of humility. The new passengers descended into the metro, which was the geometry of waiting, dirty, but safe. They saw the neighbors without faces sleeping on the steel tram rails and understood that the main rule was equality before the threat. The lesson of movement. They watched the stubborn conductor selling tickets for the shrunk route. The tram, moving on patched tracks, was the first lesson of hope. It showed movement is possible, but it requires effort and risk. The lesson of cleanliness. The new passengers observed the indestructible memorial of the utility workers. They saw workers raising torn wires and welding pipes. Their clean, daily labor was an example of how to respond to chaos. The city demanded that they abandon old habits, the demand for perfect comfort. It offered them instead a sense of belonging to a great resilience. The process of integrating the new passengers was slow and painful. It happened through nonverbal rituals and synchronization with the city's rhythm. Searching for their shard. Every returnee began by searching for their house, their apartment. They collected the surviving fragments of memory photos, books, children's drawings. This act was the first step toward accepting the pain. Lighting the candle. Installing their first light bulb in the basement or in a surviving area. This was an act of joining the collective resistance of light. Their light joined the collective lighthouse. 3. The first run. A ride on the tram along the shrunk route was a baptism. They paid the stubborn conductor, received a ticket, and felt the creak of the wheels beneath them. They became a part of the movement. The new passenger ceased to be a foreigner. Their eyes lost the shock and began to acquire the resilience of the neighbors without faces. They started to hear the aroma of life through the smell of char. They started to believe in the rails. Kharkiv accepted them. Their return was not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new era, the era of reconstruction that starts with the realization and acceptance of pain and continues according to the stubborn conductor's schedule. Flowers at the stop. The aesthetics of resistance after the difficult phase of adaptation and acceptance of pain witnessed by the new passengers. The collective consciousness of Kharkiv moved into an active, creative phase of resistance. If the indestructible memorial of the utility workers responded to the roar with steel and concrete, the new movement responded with colors and life. This was the movement of flowers at the stop. Saltivka, mutilated and gray with dust and char, demanded color. Destruction attempted to assert the monochromatism of death, but the city replied with an explosion of greenery and colors. The deepest, blackest wounds on the city's body, the shell craters, became the first canvases of the aesthetics of resistance. Craters, ripped out of the asphalt and earth, were huge, ugly holes filled with water and debris. They were physical proof of violence, but the neighbors without faces refused to see only pain in them. Cleansing. Quietly, silently, without commands, people began to cleanse these wounds. They pulled out bent shrapnel, broken concrete, removed the polluted water. This labor was therapeutic. It was the analog of a surgical operation on the city's body. Filling. Instead of garbage, they brought in clean earth, peat, and fertilizer. Resources were hard-won, shared in small amounts, but every sack was an act of faith. Planting. And so, inside the crater, where the source of death lay, appeared seedlings, petunias, marigolds, daisies. They were bright, fragile, yet unyielding. They asserted, in this place there will not be a memory of the explosion, but a memory of the life that grew through. The crater turned into a flower bed. The flower bed became a memorial of a new kind, not frozen, but flowering, a living memorial. Color became the programming code of resistance. War attempted to establish a monochrome gray concrete, black char, brown mud. The city responded with a palette. Psychological defense. Bright red, yellow, purple spots of flowers acted as a psychological shield. They intercepted attention from the ruins, forcing the eyes that had seen too much horror to focus on beauty. The code of life. Flowers appeared everywhere. In old tires, in broken vases, in concrete cracks, at the tram stops. They grew along the shrunk route, turning the path of the stubborn conductor into a gallery of resilience. Their pure aesthetic negated chaos and confirmed the principle of order. Invisible communication. The flowers became a nonverbal message for the new passengers. They said, "We are here. We are watering. Life is valuable, and it will win." This was an affirmation of the human need for beauty, which cannot be destroyed even under the strikes of drones. The stubbornness of the person who planted a tulip on the edge of a crater was stronger than the stubbornness of the roar. Flowers required care. In conditions of water deficit, despite the heroism of the indestructible memorial of the plumbers, watering became another sacred ritual. Collective care. Every flower bed at the tram stop had an unspoken caretaker, a neighbor without a face, who carried water at risk to life. This was a collective commitment to beauty. Watering was an act of tenderness and creation against the backdrop of universal destruction. Purity. Flowers were the only clean spot in this dirty landscape. Their care required the removal of dust, shards, and debris. They were a constant reminder that order is achievable. The aesthetics of resistance captured Kharkiv. The city was turning its scars into blooming gardens. This was a message to the enemy. You brought us death, but we will answer with life. Your hatred will give birth to our beauty. The tram, creaking past these blooming wounds, now carried not just passengers, but witnesses to this stubborn flowering. It carried hope, painted in bright, life-affirming tones. The first pull restoring the nerves. After the city psychologically affirmed its will with color flowers at the stop and resilience. The indestructible memorial. The time came for a physical, tangible victory. The time to translate the collective will into steel and electricity. The main, most painful wound on Kharkiv's body remained the rupture of the tram route on the border of Saltivka. There, where the rails were twisted into spirals and ripped from the concrete by direct hits, the hope for full movement ended. The restoration of this section was not merely a repair, but a symbolic act of conquering the future. The work began silently, methodically, like the work of archaeologists on a battlefield. Utility workers, the fighters of the indestructible memorial, entered the final battle with the ruins. Exile of chaos. First, the twisted old rails had to be ripped from the earth. They resisted, held by the concrete and memory. Their contorted forms were the physical manifestation of the roar. Extracting this scrap metal was an act of asserting order over chaos, cleansing the wounds. Shell craters were cleared to the bottom. Every piece of gravel, every piece of plastic was removed. These wounds of the city required sterile purity before laying a new foundation. New foundation. In place of the destroyed concrete, a new, clean, durable mortar was poured. This new foundation was heavy, unwavering, a symbol that Kharkiv would no longer allow its roots to be destroyed. The collective consciousness of the residents observed this labor. Neighbors without faces brought water to the workers, participated in clearing debris at the stops. Every strike of the hammer, every cubic meter of concrete mixed was a collective breath of hope. The most important, most thrilling moment was the welding of the new rails. New rails, long, heavy, absolutely straight, were brought to the site. They were a contrast to the bent shrapnel around them. They were a promise of a future that would be logical and direct. Symbolism of the straight line. A rail cannot be crooked. Its essence is precision. In a world where all lines were distorted by war, the new straight rail was an affirmation of order and truth. The splicing, the welding process required extreme concentration. Workers, bending over the steel, joined the two ends into a single whole. The welding spark was the brightest light the city had seen since the blackouts. It was a temporary substitute for the sun, an artificial fire of creation. The metaphor of reunion. Joining to pieces of steel was a metaphor for the reunion of Kharkiv itself. The destroyed route was healing back, restoring the integrity of the city's body. The stubborn conductor came to this section every day, not to help, but to witness. She watched as her path was restored, as the logic of her mission returned. She knew, when the rail is whole, the ticket will once again have full value. After laying the rails, it was the turn of the electricity. The pulling of the contact wire, the nerve of movement, was the final chord, restoring the support. First, new, sturdy supports were installed, replacing the old, twisted crosses. They stood straight, unwavering, asserting their right to the sky. Tension. The wire, thin, metallic, was stretched between the supports. The tension was critical. It had to be perfect. It was the tension of the city's will, the readiness for continuous movement, the act of completion. When the last clamp was secured, the utility workers left. They left behind a clean section of track with a wire ready to receive current. This was a gift to the city and a symbol of the completed work of the indestructible memorial. The collective consciousness understood. Movement was restored not only on the ground but also in the sky. The rails were connected. The circuit was closed. Saltivka was ready to receive its last tram. Only one thing remained: to hear the laughter and send the carriage on its way. Laughter in the metro, the pure frequency. After the physical victory, the first pull of the rails, and the restoration of the contact network, the collective consciousness of Kharkiv awaited psychological resolution. The labor of the indestructible memorial was complete, but the city could not move forward until it heard its true, pure voice. That voice was laughter. Children's laughter was the very first casualty of the roar. It was driven into basements, stifled by fear, suppressed by the weight of the metaphor of dirt. In the geometry of waiting underground, children learned to be silent, their eyes to adult, their games quiet and watchful. The return of laughter became a symbol that the threat was a thing of the past. that peace was possible again. The city's collective sound filter had learned to cut out many things. The crackling, the grinding, the menacing whine of artillery. But it had to learn to accept back the pure frequency of joy. Laughter was first heard in the metro system where it had been hidden. The underground became not only a bomb shelter, but a temporary school of life. When the tension on the surface decreased, and the alert became rare, the children's psyche began to free itself. First sounds. At first, it was not laughter, but a timid sob, turning into a loud sigh. Then into an uncertain yelp of joy from a successful game in a cardboard house. This was the process of decompressing fear. The rhythm of play. Loud, continuous children's laughter was impossible for many months. Now it appeared in bursts, filling the space of the rails and platforms. The laughter was chaotic, but in this chaos, there was an absolute logic, the logic of carelessness. Frequency comparison. Laughter was a high, pure frequency that completely countered the low, menacing rumble of the roar. It was proof that the high frequencies of life are stronger than the low frequencies of death. The neighbors without faces listened to this laughter with a smile that was mixed with pain. They understood. Laughter was the most accurate signal of peace. As long as the children laugh, Kharkiv is not defeated. When the geometry of waiting began to melt, the rails once again received trains, and the station became only a transport hub. The laughter moved to the surface. Parks and flowers. Children filled the few surviving parks and courtyards. Their laughter echoed over the craters next to the flowers at the stop. Laughter became the soundtrack to the aesthetics of resistance. Loud laughter was a risk, but this risk was accepted by the entire city as a symbol of restored trust in the sky. Breaking the silence. Laughter broke the heavy, watchful silence of the ruins. It was the voice that finally shouted down the anxious whisper of fear. It was proof for the new passengers. The city is once again fit for living. Laughter against mopeds. Most importantly, laughter was the absolute answer to the sound of mopeds. Drones carried the mechanical, cold buzzing of death. Laughter was the living, unpredictable, chaotic sound of life. One was the sound of a machine, the other the sound of a soul. And the soul was winning. The return of laughter was the final signal for the completion of the mission. The rails on the border of Saltivka were ready to receive current. The wires were taut. The tram, clean and checked, waited in the depot. The stubborn conductor listened to the children's laughter from the window of her carriage. Her quiet voice and ticket sales would now be accompanied by this pure frequency. Her work had received its final justification. Laughter was the rhythm that had to launch the city's machine. It was the starting signal for the last tram. The last tram, the unstoppable movement. The fortress city was waiting. The roar had turned into a distant, rare echo. The sound of mopeds became history, muffled by the working noise of restoration. Children's laughter pulsed on the surface, confirming Kharkiv's readiness for the final act of revival. The rails were whole. The line that was ruptured on the border of Saltivka was once again stitched with steel and current. The labor of the indestructible memorial was complete. The first pull had become a full, continuous path. The day of the run arrived. The tram left the depot early in the morning. It was cleaned, washed of the metaphor of dirt. Its windows were whole, transparent. It was a carrier of purity in a world that still smelled of gas and ash. The silent driver drove it. His hands were steady. The stubborn conductor stood inside. Her uniform was impeccable, and the stack of tickets lay ready, the artifacts of a new day. The tram moved along the very route that had been shrunk by the war. It passed by the benches where the light bulb in the basement had burned, past the last pavilion that had endured everything. The passengers were special. They were the neighbors without faces, the new passengers, the children who laughed with the laughter that had conquered fear. They filled the carriage, but did not crowd. Their movement was filled with respect for the moment. Every section of the path was a memory and a victory. The squeak of the wheels. The squeak of the wheels on the restored joints was a rhythm that confirmed the logic of movement. It negated the creak of torn doors and the groans of destroyed buildings. The flowers. The tram passed by the flowers at the stop, past the crater turned into a flower bed. And the brightness of these flowers seemed doubly stronger, washed by the speed of the carriage. The gaze. Passengers looked out the windows not with horror, but with acknowledgement. They saw the scars of Saltivka, but now these scars were framed by the new strength of concrete and the light of glass. The tram reached the section that had previously been the final point of the shrunk route, where the transfer to the zone of mortal risk used to be. Now lay new, straight rails. The silent driver increased the speed. The carriage smoothly passed the rupture point. This was a symbolic victory over chaos. The line was whole. The conductor walked to the front of the carriage. She did not announce a stop, she announced a new epoch. Her voice was even, but filled with unspoken triumph. Saltivka, terminus. The entire route is restored. Saltivka met the tram not with a salute, but with silence and acknowledgement. Residents who had endured the deepest pain came out of their shelters and simply watched. They saw not just a carriage, but the return of normality. The proof that their suffering was not in vain. The last tram reached the final stop. It stood on new, solid concrete, ready for the return run. Its movement was irreversible. Kharkiv completed its chronicle. The roar subsided, the laughter sounded, the tram ran. The collective consciousness asserted. Life did not stop. It contracted, went underground, became stubborn, learned to filter fear. But now it has returned to the rails. The last tram was a living memorial to Kharkiv's resilience. It was proof that no roar, no drone, no blackout could destroy the city's will to move. The tram awaited passengers for the return run to the center. The rails once again shone in the sun, turning from arteries of pain into the steel threads of the future.